So I was excited when I saw that we lost a speaker because it tells me that I can either talk twice as slow, right, and fill my 50-minute presentation with 25 minutes of slides, or I can actually say twice as much. So I was going to take a show of hands for whether you'd like me to talk slow or talk a lot. But I'm not sure that I would be able to get the density of hands from the way people are distributed in the room. You know, we talk a lot about strategic partnerships, strategic alliances, and I don't know that we spend enough time talking about what we're actually trying to deliver with those partnerships. And I think that's something that we should really take a pause and explore, because at the end of the day, if we deliver a very efficient partnership, i.e. we operationalize these projects very, very well, but we don't deliver a successful product to the market, then we've got a very efficient, very unproductive model, right? At the same time, if we deliver a lot of products to the model, but we do that inefficiently, we've got a very expensive model. And I think when we talk about our strategic partnerships, we need to keep both in mind. Christy, I think you did a very nice job of describing kind of the process by which we get to a cultural fit with these partners. At the end of the day, when we, you know, at PPD think about the strategic alliances that we're creating, we take a step back also and we say, you know what, we want to create relationships where we can develop investment strategies. So when I stand up here today, I'm not going to stand up here and talk about the science of vaccine development or the medicine of vaccine development. There's a lot of other people here who are much more expert at that than I am. But what I will talk about is how can we make sure that we're creating relationships that allow us to maximize the investments we're willing to make, both by us and by the sponsor, and then how do we make sure that we maximize the returns on those investments. And I think when we start to think about the strategic alliances from that perspective, it begins to offer some additional you know, kind of color around how those investments might pay dividends for us in the long run. I only have 25 minutes today. There's a lot to cover. I'm not going to read the slides. I think that it is important for us to keep in mind that we do have an industry that has a burning platform right now. When I look up on the banner here and look at some of the organizations that are represented, many of them, PPD included, are at a kind of a point in time in the industry where we've got to get better at what we're doing. We've got to get more efficient. We've got to get more productive. We've got to start delivering new medicines to the market faster than we have in the past. And I think that burning platform has created an environment in which the way that people have used organizations like us, the sourcing strategies that they've used, have moved beyond a capacity management and into a competency-based sourcing strategy. And I'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. We'll set out some of the expectations that we have with regard to what we expect strategic partners to deliver. We have an enterprise view that I think is important because that begins to demonstrate the scale that these partnerships can create. Obviously, there's a number of benefits we think are present with regard to partnering, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some specific examples around how the investments that PPD and other organizations have made generate opportunities for returns for not only us, but for our customers as well. I always kind of start when I want to kind of set the foundation. I always start with this historical view of sourcing and how organizations like PPD have kind of grown up. I started at PPD back in 1992. I was a CRA. We had 150 people, and it was very prescriptive with the way that a sponsor used us. First study I ever did was a GSK study. It was an 8-page trip report, and I had a little tandy that gave me 6 lines of text to read. It took me a long time to scroll in between, but it was before computers. I don't know that my gray hair is signaling that, but we did an awful lot of work back then, and it wasn't necessarily as efficient as it could be, but we got a lot of work done as well. I think what's important here is recognizing that at that time, organizations like ours, CROs, CMOs, et cetera, really were built around this need to source capacity. So the sponsors would essentially vertically integrate. They maintained all of the competencies inside, and then they maintained that competency up to a certain level and decided that they would source the rest. And the rough rule of thumb is around 70%. So sponsors would say, you know what, I'm going to maintain a present that allows me to do 70% of my work, and the other 30% I'm going to source either through a contracting strategy or through a CRO strategy. And I think that over time, as we in our industry and other industries have gotten better at those competencies, sponsors have begun to shift and realize that some of that expertise is actually beginning to migrate into our industry. And as a consequence, the platform for innovation, the platform for change, resides as much with us as it does with our sponsor organizations. I don't know how many people are familiar with the theory of the firm. Ronald Coase put this out in, I think it was like 1937, and his focus at the time was around Ford, and it was around vertical integration. Henry Ford decided that he wanted to control all aspects of that supply chain, so he bought the rubber plantations, he bought the boats that shipped the rubber, he bought the plants that made the tires, and he had obviously the automobile manufacturing facilities to put the tires on. And what happened at that time is it was much cheaper for him to manage that entire supply chain himself. But as competitors came up and as other organizations decided to explore avenues into each of those steps in the supply chain, it became as economical for an organization like Ford to outsource certain of those categories as it was for them to have it inside. And Coase talks about the theory of the firm, where a firm will expand or contract such that the cost to transact something internally is the same as it is to transact it externally. And I think that we all saw back in the mid-90s or so a significant downsizing pressure on pharma that we're still seeing today. Many, many companies are saying, you know what, we need to get smaller, we need to get more nimble. And a lot of that has to do with this theory of the firm, that companies expanded beyond their scope, things changed, external transaction costs became less, and as a result, these companies found themselves to be too big. It's not unlike something, you know, some of the challenges that PPD has experienced at 11,000 people. We need to make sure that we stay nimble in this environment as well. If we think about what some of those external transaction cost reductions have been kind of originated from, it's things like the advent of the internet, and the internet not necessarily as a revenue tool to generate revenue off of. There's a number of companies that have been able to do that, but we haven't necessarily found that in our space. But what it has done is created a lot of efficiencies. It's become much more efficient for us to transact with partners, for us to be able to exchange information, to be able to do a lot of that business-to-business interface through technology that then reduces the transaction costs externally and makes it much more, I think, viable for these partnerships to develop. We've developed a number of competencies in our industry and in other industries. Each of the organizations in our industry have a particular core competency that they focus on. PPD started with monitoring, Quintel started with biostatistics. We tend to fall back on what those competencies were, and I think it's important that we recognize that, you know, as a P&L-based type organization, we have been forced to innovate and stay contemporary with the way that we do a lot of this work. It's very expensive to hire in that intellectual capital. The people that are expert in the vaccine space and in other spaces don't come cheaply. And it's, you know, obviously a very important investment for a sponsor to consider, and if that can be accessed via a partnership such that you don't have to bear that fixed cost yourself, there's some real advantages to having access to that expertise without having to maintain that expertise internally. We've talked a bit about the P&L-based supplier focus as well. You know, as a expense line on the income statement for our sponsors, the sponsor tends to have a different kind of pressure on them for how they innovate, and a lot of that innovation is around reducing cost. As a P&L-based focus, ours is as much around how do we create value, how do we create outputs out of the resources that we invest. You could argue that one's just kind of a mirror image of the other, and that's probably true. But I do think that P&L focus puts an emphasis on us, because if we don't innovate, we don't make money. If we don't make money, we don't survive. And I think that's a very important pressure for us to recognize. This NPV idea around how we make investment decisions. We'll have some examples later where we've made some investment decisions into the development of a certain assay or maybe the acquisition of a certain facility. Other organizations have done the same. And our horizon on that return is not limited to a project or a particular organization. We can monetize those assets and then apply them across a much broader spectrum. So for a sponsor organization to develop an assay that then can't be commercialized, creates a stranded asset for them that we can actually monetize if it's inside one of your supplier partners. And then I think this other idea around internal costs and stranded resources. When we think about flu vaccines and we have the seasonal aspects of the flu vaccine and we need to follow the flu across the globe, it doesn't make sense for a sponsor organization to staff up in each of these regions as that moves around. That's something that can actually be capacity managed through their partnerships. What we're really trying to do is create that synergy between the two organizations so we can focus on what we do well, you can focus on what you do well, and together we actually have, I think, a synergistic effect. I don't know if this is a new concept for folks or not, but there has been a lot of articles written around FIPCo versus FIPNet. FIPCo would be the fully integrated pharmaceutical company. That's that vertical integrated kind of supply chain. You see it with Ford. You see what's happened with the auto industry. I think history has a tendency to repeat itself, maybe not in the same industry, but in ours today. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that vertical integration is not necessarily going to be the way of the future, and what we're seeing a lot in our space is this idea of FIPNet, a fully integrated pharmaceutical network of organizations, where sponsor organizations actually have a competence around how they weave that network together and manage that network, and they let the suppliers actually provide the competencies that are important for them to be successful, but not necessarily considered key competencies to the sponsor organization. So the previous graphic that I put up actually begins to change and shows how this becomes more of a competency-based sourcing strategy, where an organization, a sponsor organization, stands back and says, what is core to me? What is key to me? What are my competitive advantages? How do I create that differentiation? And then everything else that doesn't address those three things tends to be sourced out. So, it begs the question of, is clinical monitoring a core competence? Does it create a competitive advantage for a sponsor organization? And if the answer is no, chances are pretty good that's going to be a good competence to be targeting for outsourcing. If regulatory is something that the sponsor considers to be near and dear to them, then that's something that, for that particular sponsor may not lend itself to be sourced. I saw my colleague Henrietta walk in. I picked the wrong example for Henrietta, who heads our regulatory group. So that's a great model for outsourcing, Henrietta. I think there's a number of different categories, and these are all going to be customer-specific questions. So when people come up to me and say, what's the right model, my first question back is, what are your competitive advantages, right? How do you create competitive differentiation? And if the competency you're considering doesn't create that for you, then that's probably a good target for outsourcing. When we force down the competency base, this doesn't mean that CRO model goes away. It just means that what historically had been insourced at a sponsor becomes something that is also outsourced. And I was with a customer earlier today who was talking about two different sourcing models. They have an insourced model and they have an outsourced model. Their outsourced model is project-based through the CRO. Their insourced model is actually still an outsourced model, but it's through an FSP model, a functional service provider model, where all of the clinical monitors are provided by a partnering organization. So they don't maintain that competence themselves, but they still consider it an insourced model because it's being addressed, or because it's addressing what historically had been insourced work. And I think that's a key distinction because these models don't necessarily compete for each other. They're actually very complementary. A lot of talk around preferred partnerships and strategic alliances. I think what's important here is recognizing that all of this is an evolution. Too often in the industry, we've said to customers, you give us a lot of work and we'll wrap a relationship around that. And I think what we're seeing now is this idea that we'll wrap a relationship around the customer that then receives the work. So the work's a consequence of the relationship and not the other way around. And I think that's really important because when we look at preferred partnerships today, not strategic alliances, but preferred partnerships, really what we see are relationships that create efficient ways of contracting together. There's an MSA, there's a work order, there's preferred rates, there's volume discounts, but none of them really have created this platform for innovation. None of them have really created this opportunity to drive value. And that's the step that we think is going to be necessary as we go from preferred partnership to strategic alliance. How are we working together to create value? Value for you and value for us. And I think those are really important questions, and they're very different. The other thing that I'll make mention of is too often we think that once we execute the MSA and have the work order format in place, the hard work on developing that relationship is over. It's defined by the contract. The reality is that's just the beginning. And what the relationship is going to be in 3, 4, 5 years is going to be very different from where that relationship is today. When we think about strategic alliances at PPD, we think about those strategic alliances from the perspective of what investments are we willing to make in, be they capital, funding, be they technology acquisitions, be they resources, to optimize the performance of that delivery model. And frankly, it's incumbent on us to make sure that within these partnerships, we're as interested in driving their portfolio as we are driving our revenue. So if a solution takes that customer away from PPD, but it's a better solution than what we can offer, it's incumbent on us to suggest that because we need their portfolio to be successful. And if that means that it's going to drive work to another organization, but that's going to optimize their chances for success, then we have an obligation to that relationship to encourage them to make that decision. I don't know how many people attended Dr. Babbis's presentation. I think it was yesterday. This is a slide that I, shamefully pulled out of his slide deck and am presenting. It really just shows kind of an order of magnitude of the vaccine work that's out there. It is not insignificant. And with the advent of vaccine therapeutics and oncology and other areas, we expect this space to really significantly grow. I think what's nice about this, though, is that this space is really at an opportunity to leapfrog kind of what the history has been, right? Because it's an emerging market within within our emerging regions. And what's important to keep in mind there is we don't need to necessarily put this back into the business models that are currently being challenged. We have an opportunity to create new business models, new partnerships, new ways of connecting these organizations to drive, I think, increased value in this vaccine space. I think I opted to talk fast and short, so that's probably a good thing. Key challenges in vaccine development. Obviously it's an emerging market, so there's a lot of organizations that are out there looking for new ways to develop these molecules. And I think that it also is happening at a time when we've got a lot of emerging geographies that are out there as well. So the question is, how can you have that much kind of uncertainty in an emerging market and an emerging geography, and how do you reduce the risk associated with that uncertainty? And looking for partners who are expert in one or the other, these emerging markets or in the geographies, is going to be an important consideration. Lots of data flow in these trials, data flow across many, many different labs, clinical data, GCL data, et cetera. How that data gets integrated is going to be important. So, organizations that are expert in data logistics are going to be every bit as important as organizations that are expert in vaccine science and medicine. There's a lot of assays that need to be developed in order to support these vaccine development programs, and what happens afterward. I have an example later around the Merck acquisition of the Wayne lab that PPD had, where Merck had gone through their HPV development program, and at the end of it, they had this vaccine lab that had been used to support the development, but it didn't have a whole lot of utility for Merck moving forward. So the question was, how do we commercialize that asset? How do we monetize that? How do we create some value out of that? Well, they created that value by selling that asset to PPD and allowing us to commercialize it for them. I think that's an important consideration, because all of these things are going to be considerations as organizations move their vaccines through the development path. Multiple suppliers required to address concomitant use trials. Lots and lots of different vaccines that are out there. We need to make sure that they're all kind of maintain their integrity as we introduce new vaccines into the patient. That requires an awful lot of concomitant use trials. These types of trials are unique to the vaccine space, or largely unique to the vaccine space. Organizing them, managing them is going to be a very important opportunity for creating value in the future. And then it's a very, very competitive space. The slide previously showed that. There's an awful lot of organizations that are in this. Vaccine prophylaxis and vaccine therapeutics are very, very hot topics for today, just like biosimilars and some of the other types of programs that are out there, and there's a lot of companies that are competing for this space. So when we think about the portfolio versus the versus the enterprise view, we bucket that under what we call the integrated view. That portfolio view is kind of the traditional project or program-based view. So there could be a vaccine program that is synonymous with Project A in this slide. Where we see the opportunity to create synergies and create efficiencies is in this enterprise view, where we have a way of propagating lessons learned and knowledge transfer across the different projects and across the different programs, within a customer or across customers. And it's where we can create those scale economies that really we think generate some opportunity for an organization like ours, which is as much involved in managing data logistics across the globe as it is in managing some of the clinical endpoints and other types of more science and medical related topics. You can see on this slide as well, I've listed a number of different types of competencies that can be applied across these programs. What's important here is recognizing that each of these can be independent. The question is, do you weave them together? So many of the organizations that have adopted to go for this kind of FIPNet strategy have decided that it makes sense to outsource a competence, but they haven't necessarily decided that it makes sense to outsource multiple competencies to one organization. So the question is there value in weaving multiple competencies together? And we've seen some organizations that have arrived at the conclusion that the answer is yes, and we've seen other organizations who haven't been able to tease out what that value is. The goals of the enterprise model are to achieve goal alignment. We want to make sure that we have a very efficient and a very productive model. We want to make sure that we've got a platform for innovation. It's very difficult for an organization to innovate on a project, but if I can innovate across a competence, I have a lot more opportunity to create value there. We want to make sure that we are financially aligned with delivery so that we're successful if the program is successful. We want to leverage economy of scales and the other bullets on the slide. I mean, really it's around creating a sustainable platform that when we innovate on top of it, it creates an opportunity for us to continue to sustain and drive value as we move that forward. I'm sure there was some discussion out there over the past couple of days around this idea of risk sharing. I want to disabuse the notion that people have that CROs don't share risk. I think that's a bit of a misnomer. The reality is we share risk on every single one of our projects. The question is how much risk are we willing to share? And I think what's important there is recognizing that the risk that we automatically take on in every project is risk around delivery. Christy was up here earlier and talking about metrics associated with delivery and making sure that we've got cultural fit. All those things are really, really important. The reality is delivery is an entry requirement now, right? Quality and delivery are not options. They're entry requirements. So the way you differentiate your organization is around customer satisfaction, customer advocacy, creating an experience with that customer that keeps them coming back. We've had plenty of examples at PPD where we've delivered, but the customer hasn't been very satisfied. We've had other examples where the customer was very satisfied and we haven't delivered. So these are not synonymous things. What's important here, though, is that since we are committing to quality and delivery, we take that risk on. So if we have to repeat because we failed, because our staff didn't perform, we're going to do that without any obligation on the sponsor to reimburse us for that additional expense. That's a risk that we take on. When we execute an MSA and we put in place in that MSA things like inflation caps and currency exchange rate caps, we take on financial risk. We may bracket that plus or minus 5%, but there's still financial risk that we take on. I was involved in a project back in, I guess it was 98, 99, that was bid at a 0.8 exchange rate with the euro. That exchange rate is now 1.5, 1.6. We didn't have caveats in the contract that allowed us to manage that currency risk, and we took a bath on that project. It wasn't anything that anybody had done. It was an external market force that created this environment. That's a risk that we take on. When we think about what kind of risks are we willing to take on, we also want to associate that risk with when can we get involved and when can we start to influence the design of those programs. And so this graphic here shows how we're willing to take on an increasing amount of risk to the extent that we can also have an increasing amount of influence earlier in the program. And the next slide that I'll show kind of buckets the 7 types of risk that we characterize at PPD. The performance risk, that's in every contract. There's no obligation. We take that on. The financial risk oftentimes is either at the contract or the MSA level. We do protect ourselves around that, but there's still a risk that we take on. Development risk, guarantees around enrollment, cycle times for startup, et cetera. These things are important deliverables for our customers at the project level, but what's important there is recognizing that if it's prescribed to us, the sites and the geographies, et cetera, it's going to be very difficult for us to take that on. If we have autonomy to influence those decisions, then those are going to be risks that we're willing to share. As we move back up into the earlier engagement, there's scientific and medical risk that we will consider. There's certain types of risk, like market risk, that an organization like PPD is not going to take on. That we consider that to be a sponsor risk, and it's very difficult to transfer that. But any of these risks in the right financial structure can be transferred to your partners, and certainly can be managed within the strategic alliance that's been created. So where were we, right? In the past, we were very focused on price. We were very focused on technical expertise. I think, Christy's description around understanding hiring practices and understanding how are you creating that culture is really important. But we are, I think, beginning to see that it's moving beyond the who is it that's actually on the projects, and how is that organization performing as a corporate partner to the sponsor. And that's where we start to see these ideas around innovation, integration, creating an autonomous structure for us so we can operate in a way that is very efficient. It's not necessarily prescribing how we do it, it's just prescribing what we need to do. And I think that's a very important distinction. I have a brother-in-law who owns a powdered metal plant outside Pittsburgh, and he has an exclusive contract with Chevy to make fittings that fit inside each of the four-wheel drive hubs. And Chevy doesn't come into that plant and walk through and figure out every single step and do Six Sigma analysis around how that fitting is produced. Chevy just says, here's the specifications. It's a one-page sheet, and I need you to deliver to these specifications. And I'm going to sample, and I'm going to monitor, and I'm going to make sure that you're delivering to that. But I'm not going to prescribe who it is or where it is or how it is you're going to get this done. I just need that to be delivered back. I'm not naive enough to think that we can enter into that kind of an agreement. We have a very, very highly regulated environment. But having said that, there are a lot of ways to go at this work, and I think that ways that create the best opportunity to innovate are going to be the ways that are going to survive into the future. Some of the benefits around speed and efficiency, we've talked a little bit about having access to that intellectual capital, but not having to have that intellectual capital sit as a fixed resource inside the sponsor. A lot of the partnership opportunities that are out there allow access to that capital and allow you to variabilize that resource. I think that's an important distinction. The third bullet here is one that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on. That's an assay that was developed was developed for a particular program at PPD, but what was important about that was that we had the intellectual property of that asset. So we could then take that assay, and use it on subsequent programs. And so the investment that we made into developing that assay was not, didn't have a cash flow that was generated off of the returns for that project it was developed for. The model actually was one that said, you know what, when we have this commercial assay available, there's an opportunity now for us to monetize that on subsequent projects. So we can offer that assay development at a reduced cost for that program, so the sponsor benefits because we're going to be able to monetize that moving forward. And I think those are some of the interesting features that are now a little different in this partnering environment. Historically, that assay that was developed for a project would have been retained as intellectual property by the sponsor. We're now starting to see some of this technology transfer into organizations like PPD and others, and that allows us to have that opportunity to monetize that asset in I think a more productive way. Just a couple of examples I think that are out there. I've used these in particular because these show, I think, some really creative models that are out there. The Merck lab we talked about already. PPD acquired a facility, acquired the people, and acquired technology, and then was allowed to turn around and commercialize that outside of the Merck environment. Covance, people are probably very familiar with the announcement that Covance put out, I think it was late last year, where they acquired 2 facilities in France and the UK from Sanofi, and in return got a 10-year exclusive deal around their GCL services. That's a pretty interesting opportunity. Sanofi had some stranded assets in the lab space, and they were able to monetize those by selling them to Covance. Quintiles has struck a financial deal with AstraZeneca around their clinical pharmacology unit. Those are examples of some of these proof of principle or early phase type financial structures that can be created. I think one that's not on here I probably should have put on here is Parexel's recent announcement with biosimilars with Merck, where they are an exclusive provider for biosimilars for Merck. Each of these, I think, represent very different paradigms than what the industry has historically kind of grown up on, and I think they, set the path for a brave new future into into what I think can be really meaningful strategic alliances as we move forward. So I don't know if I have made it 25 minutes, but I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Personally, I thought the approach of the FIPNet was very interesting, but as you take it to its sort of fullest extent, the service provider, say like a CRO, would become involved in the strategies of product development and would become almost an internal stakeholder. How do you see that works in some of these FIPNet approaches? Do you have adequate access to the full strategies that you can contribute and feel integrated in the program?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think that we certainly have partnerships where we have that access. And to be honest, the obligation is on us once we have that access to actually take action. Right. And so I think there are organizations who are out there who have said, here's the full access to that portfolio view, and we and others have maybe not taken the kind of action that we should have taken to prepare for that portfolio. So, it works both ways. If we ask for it and they give it to us, we better take action on it, right? I think the FIPNet is an interesting thing because, most of the organizations out there have gone through this integrated pharmaceutical network approach, but they've done it in a very competency-based way, which is important, but they haven't done it necessarily in a way that allows those competencies to be woven together. So they still manage those partners. Right. And so, if you take Lilly as an example, they've got Quintiles in North America, they've got Icon in, Western, Central, Eastern Europe, they've got Parexel in their intercontinental, their Asia-Pac region. Those 3 organizations, you don't want to necessarily give full disclosure to all 3, right? Had they picked one organization for the globe, I think the exchange probably would have been a little different. but I don't know that Lilly was able to see what that value was. And you know, we're up against some interesting paradigms, because I think organizations you know, like Lilly, like Pfizer, like Merck, et cetera, you know, believe that that strategy piece is a competence of theirs. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the Elon announcement that we put out a couple months ago, but Elon has struck a deal with PPD where we are essentially their development engine. They don't maintain a development presence to execute clinical trials. They do that through PPD. But they've retained the medical and scientific competence related to CNS and Alzheimer's. So essentially, they give us a trial for us to execute. We have influence over that. We can say, you know, I'm not sure that that's designed the right way, and our experience suggests that maybe these endpoints might make more sense. They take that as counsel, but at the end of the day, they have the ultimate say in that. I think the vaccine space is an interesting space, because I think that opportunity actually exists. At the end of the day, though, for us to leverage that opportunity, I think we are going to have to be ready to take on more of these financially constructed risk-sharing arrangements. If we want to have that say, we better be willing to put some skin in the game to say it.
Do any of the participants, the delegates here, have questions? I think it's a very complex area. Integrating it, supplementing for some of the internal resources in the pharma company while handling the issues of confidentiality, competition, and it's going to be a continuing evolution.
It is.
Congratulations.
It is.
Thank you.